Okay, so let me introduce our speaker today. So a very interesting person. So we have Dr. Anijo, so who actually heads the Department of Art and Design at American University of Sharjah, right? And Anijo comes with a very strong design thinking, and kind of he has almost like 2 decades of experience in design education, right? So Anijo is a Harvard graduate, and it is Master of Design there, and he also comes from architecture background, right? And then he is taught mostly in the US, mostly at Mississippi State of University, as well as he's also the academic director at IIT Chicago. So I think he's the right person to talk about design education and what's the gap between the design education side and the practice side. How do we bridge this gap, and what is the future of design education is going to look like. So without wasting much of your time, so over to you, Anijo. Please walk us through your experience and help us to bridge the gap between the practice and the education side of it.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to F1 Studios and you for inviting me. I know that other people are joining in, but thanks for everybody who is online and can see some familiar faces. Today, I'm going to be a little esoteric in the sense that I'm going to bring in a lot of information from the design world. So for some of the non-designers who are there, so please bear with us as we work through the design related material. So I'm going to share a presentation and I'm going to start off. So I thought that today what we will do is we'll talk a little bit about how design pedagogy and practice are not two separate things, but in my words that I shared with Dan, they're an intricate, intertwined dance, and I'll explain that in a second. So I'll get started, and then I think there's some time for questions at the end. So I hope that the conversation is going to generate some discussion, especially with the designers who I'm a little bit, you will see that I'm questioning the education that we received as designers. Okay, so let me get started. As Dan mentioned, I'll give a brief introduction. I am currently the head of Department of Art and Design at the American University of Sharjah. For those of you who don't know the American University of Sharjah, it is, some people refer to it as the Harvard of the UAE, the GCC, and it's a top university. It's very well ranked in architecture and design. And I joined last year as the head of department here. I have a background in architecture. I'm trained as a professional architect from BIT Mestra. As Dan said, I went to Harvard to do my design degree. During that time, I also spent a lot of time in technology, and you'll see how this plays out in my own work. I was at the Media Lab working on projects related to smart cities and how technology plays a role in design. And finally, I have my PhD from the Open University in the UK, where I work very specifically on urban interactions. My experience in the past is that I was an assistant professor. My pedagogical experience is that I was an assistant professor at Mississippi State for about 5 years before I moved to the IIT Institute of Design, which is probably one of the best schools of design in the world if you think about design from the perspective of strategy and innovation. And there I was an associate professor for about 11 years. And the focus there was about strategy, design strategy, which I will explain in a second. Primarily, my research interests focus on, like I said, design strategy. In this, I work on innovation with Asian multinational corporations. So I worked with several companies, but the most notable are Godrej, Far Eastern, and Finabler, all of whom are traditionally technology-led organizations. So in some sense, my team and I designed the innovation platform for these companies. So this is sort of the practice background that I have. From my research perspective, I work on what is known as futures thinking. So I take the perspective of design fiction. It is a very interesting new idea where you use design as a way to think about futures, And that I used to work with large cities, large organizations, but I also am an entrepreneur. I started my own company, which is around digital storytelling and analytics for cities and cultural organizations, partly based on the work that I did in my research. So that's it about my background. So let me get started on the content that you're all here to listen. You're here to listen to. So this particular image that you saw in my cover and that I'm showing you again is I'm particularly interested in astronomy and the way things work in the cosmic realm. And this particular image is of a binary star system in formation. So which means there are two stars. And what you can see is that these stars are sort of pulling and pushing at each other, right? And it's actually the gravitational forces of these stars that create the system, the solar system that is created around it. So the material from the stars are emanated and new material is formed all around the stars, right? So in some sense, these two stars in a cosmic dance, sort of an intertwined dance. The reason I'm pulling from astronomy is to say that it's the same thing with practice and pedagogy. If you think about design, right? So there's practice on one side and pedagogy on one side. And people in pedagogy often think of design education as this, sort of unit box where you do something and then you graduate into practice. And practitioners think of their practice as sort of pushing the boundaries. And yeah, sure, you're going to get the people from these institutions, but we have to re-educate them, right? We have to bring them up to speed with the kind of ways that we work. And then this separation is dangerous. I propose that we are constantly in, just like the binary star systems, we are in this intertwined dance of some sort, right? Like pedagogy is often influencing practice and practice is often influencing pedagogy. If it is not, then we reach sort of a stalemate where nothing happens, right? No movement happens, no new material or no new star stuff is created. And so for me, it's very important that star stuff is created, new material is created. And so this pushing and pulling is very important. So how does that work, right? So one of the things that you have to think about is as a faculty member, as an educationist, what I think about is I have many friends who are practitioners, right? Like Dan, and then there's Tane, you heard from him a few weeks ago. And so there's several people that I know that are practitioners. I'm constantly talking to them to understand how the field is evolving, right? And I'm also working with companies and organizations to understand what their needs are. And the moment I do that, what I do is I understand things from practice, and then I take that knowledge and then I make a model or a framework around it. And then I teach it to my students who then go out into practice and employ that framework or that model, right? So in some sense, what practice is giving is sort of mentorship for pedagogy, right? They're giving you points of views, giving us points of views. They're telling us about their process. Pedagogy, on the other hand, is then applying that knowledge into frameworks, providing leadership. In some sense, the thought leadership that pedagogy provides allows practice to advance and become something new. And this is that new star stuff that I was telling you about, that new material, right? So this constant push and pull is very important. And then pedagogy also allows positioning and methods. So when new methods are put into the practice field, that's when practice evolves. And new processes are developed to adapt those new methods. And so this constant dynamic is what I called an intertwined dance. So I'm going to take you a little bit into the past to tell you how this developed, right? Now, none of this should be unfamiliar for those of you who are designers, right? So you'll remember some of your design history from your schools where you went to school. So let's start off a little bit, sort of the human race had just discovered agriculture, and they realized that they needed things to store material. They needed things to record those stored materials, right? So, and what happened at this time is that craft developed. And what the economies of this time were economies of production. So you will remember that these were all craft-based, artisan-based economies, right? So if you look here on the bottom, you can see I'm tracking two different types of craft. One is product craft and the other is visual craft. And I'm sure there will be a lot of people who belong to one of the two segments listing in. So if you look at this line here, you'll see the evolution of product craft, and here you'll see the evolution of visual craft, right? So when there was economies of production, what happened was that the practice was individual craft based. So the image you're seeing are Kashmiri shawl weavers, and the craft was segregated in that community. They would weave these shawls, and they were, they're very famous around the world because of that sort of community that developed the craft. The pedagogy at this time, some of you may remember, were built around guilds and apprentices, right? So the son of the craftsman or the craft person joined the parent in understanding the craft. And over time, these became guilds that build the communities, right? So the craft itself. Now, this is another important slide, and you'll see this evolving over time. So at this point, designers and design craft, the role of the designer was that of craft person. And he or she had to add aesthetics to products, right? So the product. So you needed the competitive advantage that you had was if you understood aesthetics. And your proximal relationship at that time was to your user. So if you were making a pot for your neighbor, you didn't have to go very far. You could just walk over to that person's house and ask that person, what kind of pot do you need? And that person would say, yeah, I need pots to store grain. Okay, I'll go back and make a pot for you. So that proximal relationship was built because of proximity and interaction with the user. But the base minimum that this person needed to know at that time was materials and craft. So if you did not know your materials, if you did not know your craft, you couldn't even work, forget have a competitive advantage, okay? And of course, there were no firms or there were no designers at this time. Most of them were built around these guilds, as I said. So I was able to find some of the flags of these guilds from Florence, which is one of the most famous guild community. I think there were 17 such guilds, and you can recognize some of them, right? There's the fabrication guild, there's the woodworking guild, and so on. So these are the precursors of the design firms, as you might say. Okay, so then something happened, right? So we evolved as communities, as a civilization, and then we discovered manufacturing. Industrial revolution came about, things were invented, machines were invented, and product craft evolved. Visual craft evolved, photography was invented, right? And here something different, something evolved from the point of view of economy also. We went from economies of production to economies of scale. No longer did you have the ability to walk over to your neighbor's house to ask that person what pot they wanted, because you had to make millions or hundreds of these pots in a factory, right? And that's the difference that happened at this time. Practice at this time was collaborative. Many people worked together, but they worked together in industry, right? They were mechanics, there were machines, there were industrial equipment that made these craft. And you can see here, this is the Ford's assembly line, which basically radically changed manufacturing over time. Pedagogy, of course, and this is the formation of design pedagogy as we know it, right? This is the birth of the Bauhaus designer, and Bauhaus will play a big role in my presentation later. But most of you will remember the Bauhaus from, it was around 1919 in Germany that Bauhaus was born, and it is the idea that you can take craft-based knowledge and apply it to industrial processes and industrial design, architecture, art, photography. All of this was being experimented by the Bauhaus School of Design, right? And this is the birthplace of design education as we know it. And look at what happened to design craft. As a designer, you had to know aesthetics. Aesthetics was a given. If you did not know aesthetics, it was the base minimum to become a designer. But now, your competitive advantage came from knowledge of production and technology. So you started to understand how things would be made at mass scale. You started to understand how industrial processes were built, and your proximal relationship had shifted from the user to the factory floor or the product or the technology, right? And this change was radical because now designers were no longer just designing for users, they were designing for companies, they were designing for factories. So one of the person on the left is Raymond Loewy, the father of design, right? And he basically invented the design firm. And we all know the most important designer for most Indians is Charles, the two designers are Charles and Ray Eames, right? And Teague. These are all designers of this time, but they were defining design for industrial craft, right? And that became a big change. Okay, so then we reached the 1970s and 1980s, and something dramatic happened. The birth of digital and internet. And you see what happened to product craft. It went from factories to the computer, right? You were now designing on computers. We were buying from Amazon. Things changed dramatically all around us. No longer were we interested in economies of scale. We are now interested in economies of choice. You can have it. So Henry Ford is famous for saying you can have it in any color as long as it's black. Now, if you want to buy a car, you can go on to the, let's say, the Jaguar Land Rover site, pick your car, pick the build, pick the color, pick the metal, pick the sheen, pick the tires. You're now building choice into the way users engage with design, right? Practice has now become collaborative and internet-based. Everything is connected to everything else, and it's connected through information, right? And all of the people at F1 Studios, all of my friends who have their own firms, we are working within this realm now. And pedagogy has moved, right? Has shifted. It has shifted from being industrial design or product design or visual communication based to human-centered design. And it's interdisciplinary. In this one picture, I'm showing you pictures from my work and my school. This is from IIT Institute of Design, where there is a designer, there's a business person, and there is an engineer, all working together to understand and design a whole new experience. And it's completely human-centered because we had removed ourselves so far away from the user that we needed designers to bring the user back, right? And this is where design craft evolved quite a bit. You couldn't say anymore that I am an expert in production, I am an expert in technology, I'm an expert in product design or visual communication. I know my fonts. Every designer should know their fonts. Every designer should know how to make a web app, right? Every designer should know how to create photographs or art or products. That is the base minimum. What you really need to know is who is the user, what do the business leaders need? Designers have now become the human-centered advocate within a business conversation. So you have the business advocate, which is the CEO, you have the engineering advocate, which is the CTO, and the CDO, the Chief Design Officer, became the advocate for the human being, right, the user, and what businesses should make. And our proximal relationship changed. So when I work with these companies, I'm not working with managers anymore. I'm working with the chairman. I'm directly working with the leader of the company. And from that leader onwards, I'm working downwards, right? So I'm not working with anybody who's on the factory floor anymore. I'm working in the C-suite. That change is massive. And of course, you'll recognize the big firms of this time like Pentagram and Fuse Project, which is 8BR. IDEO is the big one, and Dublin, Deloitte, all of these companies you will recognize are starting to change and form the conversation around how design is playing a role in strategy and business, okay? But here's the kicker. The kicker is that design pedagogy, the design educational institutions out there, have not evolved beyond this space. At best, they are tackling economies of choice, and the worst ones are still stuck in economies of production. They're still trying to build expertise in aesthetics and industrial craft when the world has moved towards strategy and business, right? So you have a whole stretch here, some who are still working in this space and some who have evolved here. The kicker, however, is that we are all children of the Bauhaus. In 1919, Walter Gropius designed the curriculum for Bauhaus, and many of you may not have seen this, but you will recognize it, right? Because this is most likely your school of design used some form of the Bauhaus curriculum. This is the 1919 manifesto, and it starts from the outside with foundations. It goes into studies of material and tools, and then application at the end. The reason why I said this, I bring this up, is because in the last 100 years, design education is not evolved, right? There's foundation, there's form and material, and then there's application. I'm sure in the conversation we can have a discussion about this, but anybody who graduated 20 years ago and someone who graduated this year will recognize the same format for design education. This is a problem. The reason why this is a problem is because practice has already leapfrogged design pedagogy. Practice is now being transformed by new technologies. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, things are radically changing the way information is processed, where users buy things, where users engage things or experience things, right? Trust networks are replacing single source networks. All of this means that we are now moving into an entire new type of economy, which is called post-human economies. And if you're still stuck, if you remember my pedagogy diagram, if you're still stuck in designing aesthetics, we are too late. That program, that pedagogy has not evolved to respond to the future, let alone, has not evolved to respond to the present, let alone the future, right? And so here's the thing, right? If you think as designers you're safe, well, there's always this argument that AI is never going to replace the designer. Well, let me tell you that AI is already replacing designers. The problem is it's replacing it at small levels, and we never understand how they replace it or how they might replace it. Some of you may know this project. This was done by Ogilvy in Italy. And they wanted to create one package for every citizen of Italy, one Nutella package for every citizen of Italy. Can you imagine how much time it would have taken a designer to create that packaging? So what they did is they fed an algorithm into they designed an algorithm and fed some pattern recognition models into this algorithm. And all of a sudden, not only did they have 7 million new patterns, they manufactured that 7 million new patterns using the new manufacturing systems that were controlled by AI. Amazon is working on this, right? Amazon is working on AI-based retail experiences, no humans. The entire experience of Amazon Go is humanless, it's post-human. The system takes care of all of this, right? And Ford, for example, last couple of years ago, they released the Connected Cities system, which is a whole system, an operating system for cities to engage with mobility. Not just cars, not just the interface on the car, an entire city that is talking to each other. Imagine you're a designer educated in one of the design institutions that we are familiar with, walking up to the CEO of Ford and saying that, I know how to make the form of a car. Yeah, you know how to make the form of a car. There is the design department that does that. Go and work there. What I'm really looking for is someone who understands the connected cities, someone who understands post-human economies. I want a designer who can talk to me at that level, right? Otherwise, go and work with the shape and form, the form and material group down there. Not that it is bad. It's different. It's very different from the conversations that are happening at the C-suite, right? So, given that little history and the changes that we are seeing, I think it's time for design pedagogy to develop a new position. And we are doing this. We are trying this slowly at both IIT Institute of Design, where I taught before, and now at AUS, we are doing this, right? The three attributes that I think the new pedagogy requires. The first attribute is what I call transdisciplinary futurism. Designers are not product or experience related anymore. You are policy, strategy, conversations, post-human interactions, futures. We have to be educated, not us, but also the new designers have to be educated in futures, right? Take a look at this. In 2016, Anne Stenrose became the chief design officer for a city. This was the first time an entire city had appointed a chief design officer. Her conversations are not what posters go up on the film cinema, the cinema hall. Her conversations are not what products are, how do you design the interface for a phone app. Her conversations are how do you bring healthcare to all the people in Helsinki. If designers are not trained to think like this, then they are not trained to become Anne Stenrose. This is Vijay Kumar, one of some of our favorite hero. Vijay was a professor at IIT Institute of Design, and until 2018, he was an advisor to the government of Dubai on how innovation can help government policy. If you are a designer who's just working on UI and UX, how can you help with government policy? You don't know much about politics. You don't know anything about governance or even business. You're talking at a different level, right? I myself, after moving to the UAE, I'm working with Dubai Future Foundation and an organization called Palmwood, which is a collaboration between IDEO and the Dubai government. And our conversations are no longer about the design realm like we are used to. We're talking about how might we engage well-being for an entire country. What does well-being mean in UAE? Well-being is an abstract concept. It is not a product or an experience or a UI or a system. It's an abstract concept. You need to understand the users. You need to understand what they will be in the future. And all of this means that we have to think like a futurist rather than someone who understands form and material. So pedagogy, practice is moving forward. Pedagogy is still behind. And I think the future of design schools should be about design-led futurism. We have amazing tools at our disposal. We are great storytellers. We are craft people. We can design fiction like nobody else can, right? So I mentioned before, I use design fiction for strategy and futurism, futures thinking. What I mean by that is that I can now create future-facing artifacts, prototypes of things that are in the future, and bring them to rulers and government leaders and business leaders and say, think about what will exist in the future. How is your business or your government going to respond to this change? Right? Design has a lot of role to play in this space. If you're thinking about design craft at this time, we have to think about post-human technologies. No longer is it enough to say, I know the user, I know strategy, I know human-centered design. No. Just like everything else, it moves to the must-know category. That's the baseline. That's what you enter the conversation with. Now, your competitive advantage comes from post-human technologies, your understanding of networks and systems, of the difference between trust networks versus single source network. Your proximal relationships are no longer with business leaders. Your proximal relationships are with rulers and prime ministers and presidents. Designers have to know how to talk to these people. It's not enough to talk to business leaders anymore. And we are now at IIT, that transformation is happening. IIT is the new Bauhaus. It was established as an extension of the Bauhaus in Chicago. And over the last 5 years, we've been working on a new curriculum that was led by Professor Matt Mayfield and the new dean, Dennis Weil. And I was part of the conversation. And here's an evolution of Bauhaus curriculum. Look at what's happening. We inverted the Bauhaus curriculum. No longer do you start with the basic foundation. Your foundation is external. Your basic tools are very different. Your methods, your leadership, there's human advocacy, prototyping, systems thing. These are the basic tools. And then you apply it. Data design, digital UX, service design, civic systems, and these are the application areas that you can go into. So you see what's happening. There's a transformation in design pedagogy all around the world, and we need to think about those things. The second thing that has to change in design pedagogy is design plus entrepreneurship. Designers have to work with other people and create companies, right? Now, there are several examples of this out there, but some of the most famous ones are none. There is no design plus entrepreneurship. There's no design firm that you can say is future-facing, future-focused, design plus transdisciplinary interaction. There are some who are starting to think about it, but none yet. And this is the potential. This is the potential for practice to take ownership of what's happening out there and say, here, we are going to develop that model. But we are going to say that we are moving from solution-centric, product-based interaction to system-centric, problem-based interaction. And no longer are we talking about craft. No longer are we talking about human-centered design. We are now talking about transdisciplinary, future-centered design. This is where entrepreneurship has to go in design. And many of my friends who have firms, this is where I advise them to go. I am constantly talking to them about these things, right? Like they are learning from these conversations. And the final thing that design pedagogy has to think about is a change in the center of design. There's a reason I moved from the US to the UAE. One of the reasons I moved is because the center of design, I believe strongly that the center of design is shifting. The rise of the new middle class is going to drive this change. So recently, a company called Code Lab, which is another a friend, relative of mine, did some research. And what they found is that by 2025, the number of elite and affluent households in India will double from 8 to 16%. Just put that in perspective. 16% of India's population in 2025 is equal to 70% of the US's population. Imagine, this is the shift of the dynamic shift that we are facing, right? Asia is the new powerhouse. Asia is where the middle class is growing. If the middle class grows, then there goes design. Design grows where the middle class grows, right? This is your new user. If you're not focused on this group, then you're trying to think about design from a historical perspective, romancing the Bauhaus, romancing Helvetica, and romancing the Swiss minimalism and the Italian product. No, these guys need a completely different way of thinking. This is where the growth is. And of course, this presentation wouldn't be complete without a shout out to my friends who are actually doing this, my colleagues who are actually doing this, people who are in India, people who are in the Arab UAE, people who are in Africa and South Asia working on these interactions, right? And I wish them best of luck to grow these companies, not as interdisciplinary, human-centered enterprises, but transdisciplinary, future-centered enterprises. And once you do that, you will now push on me. Your changes will force me to change. And you will start stress testing education. You will say, I need this kind of people. I need this kind of collaborative mindset. Right? And then I will be able to say to my students, look at what the world needs. It's no longer just people who can make interfaces and widgets. They need people who can talk to government leaders. And now I can push for new fields of inquiry. I can start to do new research and provide new types of design leadership that will then go on back into this constant dance of practice and pedagogy. So that's it. Thank you. I have my email there for anybody who's interested in reaching back. But of course, I think we have an opportunity for a conversation right now. Dan?
Oh, yeah. I think that was a great presentation, Anijo. I think thanks for taking your time to, I think I just love the part of how you started your presentation with the history, a little bit of a refresh on that, and then how the design is being evolved, and then what's the gap between the practice and the design pedagogy part, right? And then what do you see as a future? So I think let's get a little bit more on that, so we can deep dive into. So I think so. What we hear from you is yes, definitely we still feel that, because as we are also running a company, so I see that always there's a gap, right, in between what is the industry and then what actually goes in the has been teaching, right? So my first question to you is like I already saw some of the ways how you wanted to fill that gap part. So how do you want to get this started? Because some of the design school even here are like, yeah, so it's been like 40-50 years, right? So how do you get this thing started? I mean, we can't just go and change this overnight. So where should it start? And also you are also asking us to like get the intervention of government, which is going to be much more bigger, especially I'm talking from perspective of being in India, right? So any thoughts on that part? Like, I mean, or all the alma maters should, go and push back and then see whether there's a change possible. What are your thoughts on that?
So there are two parts to your question. Is one is how can institutions change? The other is what role does government have to play, and how can we influence government, right? So
Right.
first, institutions have to stop romancing the past. I think there's a lot of romancing of the past, right? So you will see that like, oh, we were born out of the Bauhaus. We were born out of the old school of design. And we are not going to change that. That is classical design. Classical design is gone. Right now, if you're still stuck in classical design, you're graduating people who will become work people for companies, right? If you really want to create leaders and entrepreneurs, you have to push their mindsets, right? You have to think beyond what classical design is. So the romancing of the past has to change. The way you can stop romancing the past is by doing cutting edge research. In India, there are very few design faculty who actually do research. Very few design faculty who actually work with practice to think about new futures, right? I think that is very important part of design pedagogy. In India, design pedagogy is seen as a teaching enterprise. You teach the new people. And what happens in this teaching enterprise is, and not just in India, in Asia, in many parts of Asia, I'm using India because of the nature of the audience here, right? What happens is when you're a teaching enterprise, you inbreed. You're never going to get better than the previous professor. So I am a professor, I teach my student learns from me, and then that student joins the institution and starts teaching. But that student is a subset of my knowledge, is not my entire set. So if that student who now joins the institution is not doing research, is not talking to Dayan, and Dayan is not telling this person, look, Anijo, I don't need classical designers anymore, right? Last week, Tane said that, right? We can get classical designers from anywhere. I need people who can do this at a strategic level. Right? And if I'm not talking, I'm not pushing these boundaries, that dance is not happening, the institutions are still going to remain in this romance of the past, that we are a 22-year-old school, we were born out of the Eames, Charles and Ray Eames came to India and did this, and we were born, that's gone. You can't romance the past, you have to think about the future. The second part of your question is, how do you get government involved? Then, as far as I can see, all the governments are moving forward further than the institutions. It's the institutions that have not caught up to the governments. Think about what just in our country, in India, look at what the government is doing. Last year, they released the new NIC websites. And I was surprised, for almost 60 years, there was almost 30 years, there were no changes to the NIC websites. All of a sudden, it's well designed, it's thought about, it's human-centric. Government is moving forward. In the UAE, I'm already working with the government through Dubai Future Foundation. My role, my student last year got hired by Palmwood, and her role is to bring design into every government unit of Dubai government. Every government office is going to get a design officer in the next 5 years. And her role is to understand what that role is, what each government role is. I think government is moving forward. And you brought up something very important, alumni. I feel the alumni have a big role to play, right? And universities and institutions should have a, sort of a way to engage the alumni, not just say, oh, you're great and we are great because you're great, but to bring them into conversations, to bring them in and say, here's how we can stretch the boundaries here, right? Here's how we can, what do we need to do? And I think institutions in India are starting to do that, right? We saw IDC had a great event last year, and they're starting to think about these things, but it's not enough. You need to engage alumni on a constant basis because they have a vested interest in the institution succeeding, right? I think that covers pretty much three aspects of your question.
Right. Yep. So it kind of brings another question. So do you still think that so design? Okay, the two questions. One is like so every design school has some school of thought, right? So which means that yeah, should that be constantly changing, but still that can be as a core value, but then the pedagogy part has to keep changing it. That's one way to look at it, right?
Like let's go back to the Bauhaus, right? The reason, I'm sure everybody's heard of the Bauhaus. We all study the Bauhaus. Why we study the Bauhaus is because when they say they're a particular school of design, they are the absolute best at doing that. Nobody else comes even close to. So for example, if you look at the work of Moholy-Nagy, who was the founder of the new Bauhaus in Chicago, his photography, he was doing photography when people hadn't heard of photography, right? He was the absolute best in his field in design, right? Can institutions that say they have a particular school of thought say that they are the absolute best in that school of thought? If they are not, then they need to be, right? You can't say we are very good at product design and say that's our school of thought. Very good just doesn't cut it. You have to be the absolute best. You should be at a level where other schools are saying, we want to be like them, right? We want to copy them. We want to bring that curriculum into our system so that we are like them. That's how good you should be. That's how the Bauhaus, the Ulm, the new Bauhaus, all of these Alto, all of these schools, Politecnico Milano, they're the absolute best in what they do. And those schools of thoughts have, over time evolved. Like for example, I have a pet peeve with Indian schools that say that they're very good at product design. And then I get portfolios from these schools, and then I get portfolios from schools in China, and the comparison is night and day. The Chinese students can do product design like crazy. They're using artificial intelligence to create new materials, material forms. And here in India, we are still using clay and wood and things like that. And that nothing against those materials. It's just that if you're doing that, you need to be the absolute best at doing that, right? Your form and your designs have to look like they come out of, everybody should say that that's the model we want to emulate.
Yep. That's a pretty interesting. Yeah, as time change, we need to try and adopt it, right? So
yes,
always there's this question of at least in this practice side, design is always top down, right? So how should that work in the education side? So
can you explain what you mean by top down, Dan?
Yeah. So I think until it comes from the C-level folks, right, where they emphasize that, hey, you know what, we need designers has to be. Otherwise, it's very difficult to penetrate into a big MNCs, right? So how do you see in the education side?
Yeah, so this goes back to something that I said in my presentation, that we always think of creating work people, right? We are graduating people who will go and work in places. I think we should stop thinking like that. I think we should start thinking of, we are graduating leaders, right? We are going out there, the people who will go out there and sit in the C-suite, right? Either as at the executive level or as an advisor level. Or you educate the CEO himself or herself, right? So, for example, the IIT Institute of when I was at IIT Institute of Design, we used to work very closely with a company called Steelcase, and Jim, who was the CEO of Steelcase, was recently hired as the CEO of Ford, right? And because he had such a great relationship with the Institute of Design, when he came to Ford and he said, "Are you guys hiring designers?" "Yeah, we hire designers from, Art Center, Pasadena to do the model making and things like that." He said, "No, no, no. Where are your designers in the business field?" And because he had seen the value of design at the business field in Steelcase, he was able to bring that conversation to Ford. And Ford came next cycle, Ford came to IIT Institute of Design and started hiring people from IIT. Right? And these were not people who were now going into working at the work level, they were influencing strategy. Right? And when you influence strategy, then it's no longer a conversation about top down, it's you're influencing at the same level. Right? So that's the kind of thing that we have to start thinking about at the pedagogy level, at least. That's how I think, is that we shouldn't be graduating people who can get jobs. We should be graduating entrepreneurs, people who start their own companies, so that design is top down from the very top, or people who can take on leadership roles.
Yep. Kind of mostly kind of agree to it. So now we're getting to this interesting topic now. So should this be designed to be like kind of an elite kind of a course where you always limit, because there's always this supply and demand thing, right? So now somehow or the other, like doctor, right? I mean, medicine has become a little elite course, right? So I'm not sure. So yeah, how do we do that? I mean, so do you think that it should still be like an elite side, or should there also be compete with the rest of the professions like engineers and all this stuff, right? So
yeah. Well, one thing I can assure you is that there's more conversation about design in companies than ever before. Apple has done that for us, right? Apple has changed the landscape for us. More people want to learn what design can do for them. And then design thinking is becoming such a used word within business circles. And it's, 10 years ago, when I walked into a company, I had to explain what design thinking is. Now they're coming to me and saying, I have about 70 people from different companies registered for an online course on design thinking next week, right? And these are all business people with MBAs and business degrees. So design is now, the vocabulary is sort of shifting within the business world and the political world and the government space. Design's use is becoming more and more prevalent, right? Going back to your question, elitism, I think, is a factor of not everybody can do this, right? Not everybody can become a designer. I actually don't believe that. I think anybody is a designer. In fact, everybody is a designer up until the first grade. When from 1st to 12th is when you beat creativity out of people, right? And then we actually we tell them not to be creative. Just follow the answer. There is a right answer. Your job is to find that right answer, right? And that elitism, transformation is visible when they come to design school. The first question is, "Professor, what is the answer?" And I have to tell them, "I don't know. What do you think?" Right? And that change is so dramatic for them, so difficult for them, that there is an answer. Of course, there's an answer in physics, or there is an answer in math, but in design, there is no answer, right? Go back to your kindergarten where you were in KG and you would just sketch something, right? And show it to your teacher. Show me something. Once you show me, I can tell you how to do this, right? So I believe that once anybody can become a designer, and you can educate people to become designers, right? And that anybody should be able to do this. One big thing that is happening in India, and you saw this week, is the new curriculum. And the MOE, now as it is called, the Ministry of Education curriculum, I'm hopeful, is going to dramatically change the way design education is delivered in India. Because if you looked at the main points, anybody can take anything as long as you can combine physics with music. You can combine math with technology and design, right? So you have these sort of combinatory skills so then you're not looking at professions. You're not graduating engineers. which was one of my biggest critiques of the Indian education model, is that we are graduating engineers. No, you're graduating people who can think like engineers. You're graduating people who can think like designers. And once we get that kind of people, I think design education has to dramatically grow. Let me give you some statistics. I think the last count, there were 5,200 schools of design in China. 5,200 schools of design in China. How many schools of design are there in India, including the private schools? Right? Imagine hundreds. How do you compete with the Chinese? If there are 5,200 schools of design, each graduating 100 students, and you have 100, maybe 200 schools of design in India, each graduating 100 students, right? We have to really ramp up our game here. We are a country that loves engineering. We are a country that loves medicine, right? We have to understand that those are not the only two fields. And I'm nothing against these fields. I just feel that there are people with different skills, and they need to be nurtured and educated very early on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have a question from the audience. So I think the question is, you said that there's a huge opportunity, right? Because the 70% of 16% of some of the middle class Indians, right? So I mean, it actually covers
16%.
kind of a 70%, right, of the US. So obviously the spend is going to increase, and there's a lot of demand for good design and stuff. So, but then there are some other lot of hiccups, I think, which you covered a little bit on that. So we have a lot of other issues, like, as you said, in general, awareness to design. There's a problem with literacy, and now there's also a problem with when educating the clients. Even that we do, even at effort, right? So we need to make sure that we have to constantly keep trying to educate. Although you said there is a significant change in terms of people understand and appreciate design, but then once you ask if it's free, they're fine. The moment you're going to charge them, oh my God, okay, that's why they're going to think over, right? It's the same problem with interior designers and architects. The moment you're going to charge them a percentage of what the cost of the building is, that's where the whole question comes up. So how do you see this still, these flavors going to impact those opportunity?
So again, two parts, right? One is how do you deal with the problems of the community that are not just related to the 16%, but there are several problems of the community. Yes. The second part is how do you educate the people who can make decisions to solve for those problems, right? That's the part. I think the first part is I don't think designers have to work at the same level. Like, for example, you have MBAs and lawyers who work at multiple levels, right? Like you have people who work with, Microsoft or Warren Buffett's office or hedge funds. And then you have MBAs who work at the level of design or developing strategy for a nonprofit. And so designers can work at that same level, right? Designers can have a range too. The second part of your question is how do you educate the client, right? Then I don't think the problem is educating the client. I think if we believe as a community that our role is to beautify things, what do you think the client is going to think about design? We ourselves as a community don't believe anything more than aesthetics. We think, I'm not saying all of us, but there's a large part of us that think our role is to make things beautiful. And when you go to someone who can make things beautiful with that skill set, the client is going to say, yeah, okay, so I can get this for cheaper in China, right? Right? On the other hand, if you go to them and say that, no, if the design systems, the design institutions are themselves saying that no, design is more than just aesthetics, more than understanding production. It's about understanding what people will look like in the future, right? If you do that, then you raise yourself to the agencies like you, companies like you, raise yourself to the level of McKinsey and BCG. Companies don't think twice about paying millions of dollars to these things because they're not talking about things that can be made today. They're talking about things that can be done tomorrow, right? It's that transformation in the mindset. We have to convince ourselves that that's our role. And at this point, we say we can come in, we can take your product and make it look good, right? We can go in and make better products for you. Right? No, we should say that your entire mindset around this is wrong because that's another lecture altogether, is your entire mindset around this is wrong because the Indian consumers don't want this. We know because we have talked to the Indian consumer. So we did this with Godrej. We actually went into one of their divisions and we said, have you talked to the people? And they said, no. Why haven't you talked to people? We know. We are business people. We know how to benchmark things. We looked at Germany. We know how they do things, right? And we said, okay, let's just try it. And we went out and talked to people and they were surprised. They were surprised with what the Indian audience, the consumer wanted. And this role, this transformation and role in design has to come from us, right? And I think that's where the problem is.
Yep. So we have another question. So we are almost there. So maybe a couple of questions and we should be good. So I think you already touched point is the impact of the practice on the teaching side. And definitely there's a huge impact, right? So now how do you reduce the gap? You also gave some tips that you as a person also kind of do a lot of consulting work, right? So what is the best way that some of the teaching faculties can still be in touch with what's happening in the practice side? So how do you?
I think you're approaching it completely wrong, Darren. I think, or whoever asked the question, I think there should be two types of faculty. There should be one set of faculty that looks at extending the field of design, right? My job as a full-time research faculty is to stretch the boundaries of design. So you're now thinking, hey, what is design fiction, right? Like, how can I use design fiction within my own practice? So you should be reaching out to me and saying, Anijo, send me some material on design fiction so I can start using it in my practice. Then we should have professional faculty, adjunct faculty who come from the field, who are now teaching the students about how the field needs and how the field can work, right? I don't think the same person can do this, right? So the first person is doing research and extending the field of design. And through that extension, you being embedded in that, you're saying, I want to adopt that. Practice is now changing because of that. And then the practice faculty are coming in and stretching the minds of the research faculty and saying that, hey, you know what? The clients are no longer asking for that widget that you're teaching. That's gone. We don't do widgets anymore. Actually, that's done by XD can do that automatically, right? And so that kind of knowledge that transmission of knowledge is very important. So I think all schools, good schools, should always have a set of teaching faculty, research faculty, and then a set of practice faculty. And the numbers can be determined based on how the school is and how the school works, but that combination is very important.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I just got a little bit. I thought like it's a one person. So now it makes sense
to
have a two different. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I think just a couple more and then we are good. So in general, like you still think a design school should be kind of a separate, kind of a isolated kind of a system, or should that be part of a bigger university where you have multidisciplinary kind of thing? So what's your take?
No, I feel that design school should be a part of a bigger university system. And I don't think they should be part of technical schools. I think they should be part of liberal arts schools. I'll give you an example for this, right? Like I think the best class I've ever taken in my life was a philosophy class. And I almost failed in that class. But I still think it's the best class I've taken not because it taught me anything about design, but it forced me to think different about what I'm designing. Right? It was a philosophy class. It was broadening my mind, right? We should have classes. We should have a set of a curriculum where students can go out and take politics, economics, business, law. There should be leadership, right? I cannot, even though I started a company and I've raised money, I cannot teach entrepreneurship. Right? It's a very different thing to teach entrepreneurship than to be an entrepreneur. You can give advice, you can give tips and tricks, but you cannot teach entrepreneurship. There are certain things that you need to do. So being close to a business school, so our curriculum at AUS is a mix of business and design. So students take classes in business school and in the design school, right? And plus they take history and philosophy and psychology. So that combination is very, very important in my opinion.
Yep. Awesome. So, okay, just I said two more again. We have two more and we'll let it. So, my first question is So I think definitely there's a huge change in the way the methods in terms of design is being taught, right? So what do you think in terms of because today what's going to happen is, and let's say I move abroad and then I study there in the US and I come back and practice in some other country. So it's going to be a big struggle for these people because there's a gap still in the practice and the teaching side, right? So what do you think? I mean, should you think that it should be universal kind of a way, the way it has to be done, or there should be a lot of cultural aspects?
Yeah,
That's the
100%.
first question. Yeah. And the last, any question can be like, what do you think the future of education, design education is there?
Yeah. So the first question is a little complicated, right? And on one hand, we want to know the best thought processes out there, the best methods. So you want to go abroad and get that knowledge, right? But then we also want that person to come back to their country and apply that knowledge. That contextualization is very important, right? So at AUS, I'm very particular with my faculty that sure, we are all trained in Bauhaus or Swiss minimalism or Italian product design, but you have to know how to apply it to your culture. We have to know how to apply it to our context, right? If you don't know that, if you're not trying to understand that while you're abroad, then you're basically romancing that idea of the Western notions. That was designed for a completely different audience. You can use Swiss minimalism, but that Swiss minimalism has also, it has to appreciate the fact that our culture is very much rich and beautiful because it is colorful and bright, and if you go to South India, you can see the brightness in everything. And if you apply Helvetica to that, then you lose that richness, right? So you should know how to balance it. You need to bring that minimalism and yet be able to say that an Indian audience requires this, right? So that kind of thing. The future of education, I think, is very much connected to transdisciplinary futurism, like I said, right? Like it's this idea that no one person, that's the idea of the star designer, graduating a star designer, someone who will be the Abe Bihar or the Philip Stark or the Raymond Loewy of the future, gone. We have to be transdisciplinary, right? In your own case, Dan, you don't make beautiful, you don't make the sexy stuff, you said, right? Like you make the stuff that nobody else wants to design, and you bring design into that. And the reason you're able to do that is because your partner, I think, is an engineer, right? Your partner is an engineer?
Oh yeah, yes.
Yeah, and that
That's right.
transdisciplinary nature of your interaction is what brings the beauty to your firm. Right? And you need to have people like that. You can't just say that, oh yeah, we're all designers and we know how to make, we know how to use Helvetica and, what you said, Berlin. And we are only going to talk to people who know how to use Helvetica. No, we need to know how to talk to leaders. We need to talk to politicians and business people and engineers. And that transdisciplinary interaction is what will lead to the future of design education.
Yep, totally makes sense. Supervisor, any closing notes or advice for design students, aspiring designers, or somebody who wants to get into design?
Well, those are all very different type of people. But one thing that I do want to advise is, like I pointed out the companies that I think are the future of design in India, one of my last slides, right, including your firm, right? And I think that it's your responsibility, Diane and Tane and Shilpi and the other colleagues that I mentioned, it's your responsibility to go back and push education. It's your responsibility to stress test and argue, right? Because as alumni of these programs, you have a certain privilege. You can say that, sir, it's not going to work. You cannot just keep keep giving me these people who are educated in the same way as I was educated. I need an entire new skill set, right? So that remember the dance, the cosmic dance, is this push and pull, this argument, right? Like I'm constantly trying to talk to people, right? Whenever I go to Bombay, I make it a point to talk to my friends and figure out, okay, so what's going on in your field? Who are you talking to? What kind of clients do you have? Where are you working? So that conversation, and it's always an argument. We always end up in a fight. But at the end of that fight, and you know who I'm talking about, right? We end up in a fight, but then that fight is, at the end, we all drink and we are happy, right? We go back to being normal people. But that fight is important, that tension, that cosmic dance that happens. It pushes both to be better. And I think it's the responsibility of the designers in practice and in the profession to push back against pedagogy, and for pedagogy and educators to push back against practice constantly.
Totally. Yep. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Anijo, and you have a great weekend ahead. And
you too. Thanks
you. Again, participants. Yep.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thanks for the wonderful questions. Please let me know if you have any more questions.
Yep. Thanks, Anijo. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week. Bye.